All right. I see LIVE. Looks like we are live. Hello, hello, hello. Come on in this place. Come on in this place. I'm not even going to tell you who I am yet. I'm going to let you come on in this place. You guys come on in, as they say, and have a seat. Grab your tea, your popcorn, or whatever it is that you want to snack on right now because you, my friends, are in for a treat. You are in for a treat. Welcome back yet again for another episode of Sane and Saved. Together we will survive this coronavirus pandemic. I promise you, we will survive. How do I know? We've been through some tough stuff. God is still able. He has not stopped working just yet. And he got some more work to do. So we still will definitely survive. I am Dr. Shana D. Lewis. All my friends just call me Dr. Shana. You know me. I'm a licensed professional counselor, a motivational speaker. I'm an educator, a professor. I'm just a servant. And one of my greatest pleasures, greatest ways I absolutely love to serve is in this capacity. Insane and Saved on social media. One of the things I know is this is where the people are, and I want to be where you are. And joining me tonight, as usual, is well, as not usual, because I let him off last week. So sometimes you have to give people a night off. Sometimes. And I know I am not the easiest person to work for or with because I am extra, as my people tell me all the time. But he is back tonight, and I'm sure you're glad to see him as well. Randall F. Tucker Sr., the evangelist of South Union Church of Christ. How are you doing tonight, sir?
I'm doing well, Dr. Shane. It's good to be back in the saddle again. And we were out last week. You were on, but I was out and had a good time, great time with my family. Had an opportunity to celebrate my son's birthday. And,
Yeah.
we just had a fabulous time. And I did watch the segment last week, and you all had fun. Y'all had girls' time. It was
Yeah.
girls'
And it was such a great conversation. It was definitely very timely. We still snuck in some of that word in there as well too, just to keep us focused on the safe side. But absolutely, I believe, as my grandmother would say, we hope somebody
yeah.
last week.
Oh, yeah. Most definitely.
Somebody got some hoping. And so it was a great conversation. So thank you to all those who tuned in last week. And I hope you shared that because that was a great segment. And the good thing is today, too, I've had two different opportunities today to talk more about the back to school stuff. I was on Houston Life earlier today. And then after that, I was invited to a private KPRC Channel 2 panel discussion with some school districts and parents as well too to talk about mental health and back to school. So it's been a day full of that same conversation. So I'm always glad and here to help assist us keep our sanity because we need it, Tucker. We need it. We need it. When do your kids go back to school?
September the 8th.
Okay, they're just the same as my kids. Okay, so you still got another 2 weeks before we get into the thick of it. Well, my baby Nia is going to middle school, and she actually started this week middle school camp.
Mhm.
So they're preparing them ahead of time for what it's going to be like. So we're already kind of seeing what this is going to look like. So that's been helpful. So you have some insight, right? And you don't just walk in blind on the first day of school not knowing what's happening. So we've had a little view of it all. Did you freeze up on me, or can you still see us fine? You look frozen on my side.
I can see you fine.
Okay, your picture has frozen. I can hear you, but
Okay.
there you go. You're back now. Very
Okay.
good, very good. We want to see you in real time. All right, so let's see what family member is with us. Hello, Rochelle. Hello, Daryl Hurd, Lucy Willis, Ruby Cole, Tammy. Thank y'all for popping in. Do us a favor, hit the share button on this video. Hey, Christine, this gonna be good, y'all. Like I hope y'all caught that title. A shelter in a time of storm, and we'll talk about how we came to that in just a minute. But please hit the share button. We're going to have an absolute wonderful time tonight dealing with that topic. So, as we continue throughout this, pandemic, and as we prepare to transition and back to school, there's still a whole lot of uncertainty. There's still a whole lot of things that folks we dealing with, right? And so I know you were out last week, but just looking around and seeing what's happening, what have you noticed, Tucker, that folks what are we up against right now? I mean, things continue to transition and move. What do you feel like? Where are we right now?
I believe that we're still in the thick of things, and I would add to it that not only are we in the thick of things, but I believe that we are really about to transition
Mm-hmm.
into another phase that we've only been able to hypothesize and possibly some would say even prophesy. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know if it's going to come to pass. We don't know how this season will develop. We don't know the hindrances that we'll have to face. We know that there are many hazards, but we have not seen them yet. All of them have not been presented. We know that there are going to be some obstacles. There are going to be some challenges. But I believe that with school about to begin in many places or already underway,
Mm-hmm.
I believe we're at a new point.
Yeah.
And the next few weeks, I would say several weeks, the next month, the next 6 weeks, it's going to be very critical uh,
Mm-hmm.
as far as the trajectory and the path during this COVID-19 season.
Oh yeah, like when you said in the thick of it, when I think of the thick, that thick is like you can't even move, right? That's mud.
Like molasses,
Yeah, you like, ooh, like I can see you sure maybe, but ooh, we is hard to get over there.
absolutely.
Yeah, we are definitely still in the thick of it. We're not out of this thing yet, and it just got another layer added to it. Because when you were in the summer, there wasn't as much pressure to perform or to do, or we could just be really for the most part. But now that the kids are going back to school, it absolutely kicks it up a notch as far as
Right.
the responsibility. Parents, and we talked about this last week, our role and responsibility, we just got a whole new job. I hope y'all understand that. This is your job. I know some parents kicking and screaming right now, but
Yeah.
it's what we
Yeah.
have to do. So I still encourage
Right.
parents to make sure you're listening to tonight's conversation because this is
Right.
part of your self care. Because if you take care of you and you get your mind right, then you're able to serve and pour into the little ones that are counting upon you to do so. So yes, I'm glad that we're back tonight to continue this conversation and to help our listeners and our viewers figure out how to navigate, right? There's a whole lot of this to still be navigated, even in the midst of the thick of it. We don't know how it all turns out, but we know who holds the reins at the end. So we know we're going to be all right, no matter what it might be tonight. So our topic this evening is a shelter in a time of storm. You may say, well, that's a song, Show is. And I sure wish I could sing it for you. I can't. Tucker could probably sing it for you, but he's not here to sing tonight. We're going to let him not just sing tonight. But one of the things that's happening this weekend, I'm very, very excited and definitely honored to have been asked to speak at North Tennehal's Ladies' Day program. It's a virtual one, right? We're in that world. And that is the theme. And so I've been in study with that all week long and what I want to share with the ladies. And there's so much, right? Tucker and I talked about this beforehand. There's a lot of meat behind that. And I want to begin that conversation as a just kind of as a segue into the weekend and invite all of you to attend this weekend's Ladies' Day, which I'll give information about that later on. But when you think about a shelter in a time of storm, are we in a storm, Tucker, or are we in a storm?
We are in a storm like no other.
Yes,
Uh,
Lord.
this is a storm of, as they say, biblical proportions, but this is a storm that, like I say, we've never seen the likes of this.
Mm,
Um, there is no roadmap per se for
mm,
this particular obstacle called COVID-19.
mm,
We're
mm,
still figuring it out. And I believe that this topic is relevant
mm.
because if we're going to make it, we must get in a safe mental space.
Yes, sir.
And when we talk about the shelter that's in the time of storm, a great deal of the shelter centers around our mental space.
He does.
And so when we understand that we are in the thick of things, we need to know where to go. We need to know who to turn to. And I'm persuaded that there's no better place to turn than to God. I'm
Yes,
persuaded of that.
uh, for sure. You know, when they say, what are some things you for sure about? I'm for sure about that. Absolutely. And so when I'm thinking about the topic and we're talking about it as the shelter piece, I absolutely believe that in order for us to be able, and just in regular life, just thinking about shelter, period, we don't survive out in the element, do we?
Right.
If we were, I mean, and not to say there are people who live outside who are homeless, but they eventually do have to come inside, take a bath, or do some other things, right? The objective in a perfect world is we all have some sense of shelter because we need it from the elements of the outside. Our emotional self is no different. Sometimes we don't think about that. And I want us to consider, what are those storms that show up in our emotional self? In the midst of COVID-19, there are a lot of emotional storms. And one of the things that I have said is one of my greatest concerns is after the health pandemic is over, I am really afraid that we're going to have a mental health pandemic, because
Absolutely.
the weight of all of this is so heavy, and that we went into it ill prepared and ill equipped. We didn't have the equipment of which to do this. Like, it's kind of like being caught out in a rainstorm, and because you didn't know it was going to rain, you didn't have no umbrella, you didn't have your rain boots, you did not have a raincoat, but you just got soaking wet. And all you could do was run to the rain until you could get to your shelter. And a lot of people emotionally are in that very same place right now because we got caught out here and we were not prepared. So I want us to think about, what does some of that look like, right? And we've talked about this over time in this setting, but in the sense of a storm, when you think about anxiety, you think about depression, you think about just the overall stress that people are under right now inside of this. Like, Tucker, the level of stress of folks that I'm talking to, because I always check in with folks and I say 1 to 10, where are you right now? 10 being the most stuff you're dealing with. Are we 8, 9, 10, 12? A lot right now, like off the scale. So the level of stress is high. And what folks have to understand is, what does that do to us? How does it show up in our bodies? How does it affect us emotionally and mentally? It has a huge impact.
Right.
And if you're watching this tonight live and you have some story to share about, maybe some of the stress that you've been under or things like that, share some stuff with us. Because what I want folks to understand is you're not alone, first of all, in this storm, because we're all in this thing together. Some of us may have a rain boot, some of us may have a raincoat sometimes at this point, but we're still all here together. So
Right.
we think about just the stress, right? The stress of all of this is extremely weighty. One of the things that stress does is it stops our ability to focus or concentrate. So we're talking about a whole bunch of us stressed out, walking around and cannot think straight. We cannot think. So the simplest way that this happens, y'all, is you can't remember nothing. Where did I leave my keys? Where is that piece of paper? Where did I write that? Where did this go? So we are lost of those basic things, but that small thing can turn into something huge when it's important. So understanding how stress affects your mental capacity is very important. And then it even has a physical component too, because literally stress can kill from the inside out. And we won't get into all the medical stuff. I can leave that to Dr. Kim Sims on her show. But we really want to make sure we understand the entire components that are at play when we are feeling stressed out. What would you say, Tucker, when you think about the stress that we are under right now? We're out in this storm, some of us with no protection, there's no shelter at all. What would you say about that?
Well, first and foremost, it's a reality
Mm-hmm.
that must be resolved firstly in the mind. Um, when we consider what it means to have shelter
Mm-hmm.
in a storm, knowing that you have shelter when it's storming outside physically helps to cool and calm your senses.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it helps to soothe your mind. The aspect and the reality of what it means to have shelter begins within the mind. that one readies him or herself to understand that it's time to
Mhm.
seek shelter. You have to know when it's time to
Mhm.
seek shelter.
Mhm.
Um, the question then becomes, do you wait and seek shelter when the storm is upon you?
Hmm.
Or if you know that shelter is a good thing, do you not seek it prior to the storm
That's good.
hitting your area?
That's
So I
good.
think it involves four major components. If you look at this subject, and this is a subject, the word shelter or the subject of shelter is found in the Bible more than 80 times.
Wow.
If you include all of the other inferences to shelter, then it increases that number exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
But when you consider what it means to have shelter, biblically speaking, and I say biblically speaking, when I say biblically speaking, I mean if you trace this subject of shelter through the scriptures, then you'll find four major components.
Mm-hmm.
I also want our family to hear that when I say biblically, sometimes we attempt to divorce, or the mind, just physically, sometimes we attempt to divorce biblically from our own present day reality. Because something is biblical does not make it non, uh, it does not make it fictional. Just because we're not in the Bible in the moment of the Bible does not mean it doesn't transcend to contemporary time.
Mm-hmm.
So these four elements that I'm getting ready to mention and that we're going to discuss, not only are they relevant in the Bible, but they're relevant even right now when we speak of shelter. So here it is. All right. The first component that the Bible pushes whenever you see shelter mentioned is presence. You're talking about God's presence.
Mm-hmm.
The second component that you see is you're always speaking about God's people. God's presence and God's people is always in view. The third component of shelter is you're speaking about the psychological element of what it means to have shelter, the reality of shelter, and how the mind processes this information.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth piece would be the physicality of shelter, the physicality of shelter. So you're speaking of presence, people, psychology or psychological element, and the physical element. And all of these together are wrapped in what it means to have shelter.
Mm-hmm.
And when you uh, trace this theme throughout the scripture, you will see these four uh, properties woven throughout. And we can leap from there, but there's so much to talk about right there.
Yeah, when you think about, and I can't wait to get into that conversation because I want us to understand from all of the angles. It's almost kind of like one of those lessons that's the two parts. We may get to the first two tonight,
Yes, a lot.
and the last two
Yes, ma'am.
next week because that's huge. And I think what we have to understand too is that it's not one dimensional. That's why I like that you
No,
have the four different pieces to it because it's not just one thing. And I think when we first hear that, we just think of a house. We just think of a thing that you go under, and that's all it is, and that's the whole. That's not all of it, though, y'all. That's just a piece of it. And because of what's happening to us on the inside is precisely why we need to have this kind of shelter. So let's talk about God's presence. Let's go there first. Let's start with the first piece.
so God's presence. The first shade of shelter that we see mentioned in the Bible is found in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and Genesis 3.
Mm-hmm.
In that God has provided for man, in verse number 26 of Genesis 1, and man is created in the likeness and in the image of God. And man is then placed in a garden. And this garden includes the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
God is in Genesis 1. He creates all things. And then when man comes on the scene, God places him in the physical presence called Eden. But before he gets to the physical presence of Eden, we must first understand that God's presence must be firstly seen.
Hmm.
So whenever you're speaking about shelter in a time of storm, you cannot have shelter if all you have is yourself.
Mm.
When we speak of shelter, this idea of shelter, you're speaking of that which is able, strong enough, and capable of covering you from the outside elements,
Hmm.
from injury or any kind of danger that presents itself on the exterior of your physical presence. But before you get to that point, you have to understand that the only person who's bigger than man is God in the created order.
Hmm.
God, of course, is the creator. He made the fowls of the air, the fish of the sea, the land animals. But then in Genesis 1, he gives man dominion over all these things.
Hmm.
So the only entity that can dwarf man is God. The animals are not going to give us shelter.
Right.
The fowls of the air are not going to give us shelter. The fish of the sea are not going to give us shelter.
Mm-mm.
The only entity that can provide shelter is the presence of God. And so
Mhm.
without the presence of God, there is no shelter.
Period. That's it. Period. So if you are not in a relationship with God, then you don't have the luxury of his shelter.
And, well, I think if we put it real, I would have to say that the scripture teaches that God shines on the just as well as the unjust.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have God's presence and really not even be aware of it
Mm. Okay.
because God provides for not just his people, but all people.
True.
And what makes that such a wonderful phenomenon is that, and that shows the extent of God's unconditional love, is that regardless if I recognize him or not,
Mm-hmm.
he's still a good God.
Mm-hmm.
He's still a
Mm-hmm.
merciful God because
Mm-hmm.
he does not withhold his presence from me,
Right.
even though I may not recognize it. It goes back to what the saying used to be, grandma used to say, that God takes care of babies and food.
Right.
And I know I'm not no baby anymore.
So I must be a fool.
So,
Exactly.
when I didn't have strength enough to take care of myself, God provided. God held me. God kept me. We used to pray this prayer growing up. He's kept us from danger seen and unseen,
Yeah.
which signals that God is watching over us and providing for us, even when we are unaware.
That he's even doing it. Or giving him credit for having done it, right? And that happens a whole lot with folks because when people think they've done something so great that they think it was them and their wherewithal that allowed them to move in whatever position that they have, they and they missed the whole point there. Gotcha.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
good. So the value of acknowledging that though, right? That yes, God is he shines on the just and the unjust. But when you are in a position of being a child that actually honors him and wants his presence, and really in my head, I'm thinking seeks his presence. Like I want to see him. I want him. That is such a gift. That is a gift for him to be present in one's life. What does that look like? And we know in the beginning, in Adam and Eve's world, what it looked like for them. What does it look like for us right now? What would you say? How do we seek his presence? How do we become an active party to that?
Great question. Um, let me back up a bit and say this. The great thing about God and what really helps to make God be God is that regardless if one recognizes his presence or not, is that he's always there.
Mm-hmm.
He's always there.
Mm-hmm.
If you deny my presence
Mm-hmm.
and you deny my existence, I'm going to place my value, invest my time in something that recognizes me.
Mm-hmm.
With God, because of his tremendous love, the lights we've never seen, and the love that is incomparable. We cannot compare the way he loves us to the way someone else loves us.
Mhm.
Because even when we fail to reverence his presence, he's still there.
Mhm.
Um, Speaking to your question, how do we recognize and how do we get ourselves in position to give him glory?
Mhm.
And how does he work with his people, so to
Mhm.
speak, those that recognize him and his presence
Mhm.
and reverence his presence?
Mhm.
I think it goes back to, I would say, uh, respect for his word.
Mhm.
Jesus put it this way in John 17:17. He says, sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth.
Mhm.
And so to have an understanding and an awareness of who God is and what God has done, you will not get that awareness in quote unquote uh, the workplace. You won't get that awareness, quote unquote, in the halls of academia. You don't get that awareness in the space of oneself. You got to get outside of yourself to see how good God is. Because if you're only looking at what God does with you, then you're missing the blessings that He's working through others who are around.
Mhm.
To understand that, we have to, first of all, go back to, again, the book of Genesis.
Mhm.
If we look at Genesis, the second part, the second piece of this shelter um, subject is that God, whenever you're talking about His presence, you're always also talking about His people. Look what He did in Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, you have Adam and Eve who are in a utopia state, utopia environment. Things are well with them. God has given them all of the shelter they ever need.
Mhm.
He's given them all of the vegetation of life that they will ever need. He has given them the wherewithal and the dominion over all things that He's created. Yet they find themselves in harm's way when dealing with the serpent.
Mhm.
And so now their eyes are open. They see that they're naked. The Bible records that they go and grab leaves and make for themselves clothes,
Mhm.
attempting to cover themselves from the elements.
Mhm.
But what God does is remarkable and revolutionary because God sees, again, His presence. He sees their nakedness. He
Mhm.
sees them attempting to create shelter that they we were not made to shelter ourselves. God has always been our shelter.
Mhm.
And so what God does is He provides them with covers, animal skins. He makes a sacrifice. Here it is, family. Don't miss this. Here it goes. God sacrifices something for us, which also is a prefigure of what He continued to do and
Mhm.
would do later with Jesus.
Right.
He sacrificed and he covers his people.
Mhm.
This is why the psalmist was right in Psalm 91. Psalm 91. He says that, or Psalm, I believe it's Psalm 91. The psalmist says, Lord, you've been our dwelling place
Mhm.
through all generations. Before you made the heavens, before you made the earth, uh, before anything was created or established, we were with you. And so what the psalmist is acknowledging is the safe place is to be with God. Another example of this is when the psalmist says in Psalm 91 uh, that he that abideth under the shadow of the Almighty, or who dwelleth in the secret place. He who dwelleth in the secret place shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. The
Mhm.
secret place is the place where shelter is found. It's the presence of God. God is always concerned with his people. And the question is, are we concerned with him?
Oh, now that's a good question. Are we wrapped up in ourselves? Because this is what I understand that happens when we get in an emotional storm, like where we are right now. We get overwhelmed with all of the stuff, right? Because there's so much that's being thrown at folks, and sometimes, I talk to people all the time. It's a struggle, and there are those who struggle spiritually right now because they are so weighted down with all of the other emotional stuff that they're dealing with.
Yeah,
But I love the fact what you described earlier is that whether we acknowledge him or not, God is going to still be an amazing and awesome God. We don't have to say so for it to be so, because it already is. That's the beautiful thing about
absolutely.
that. If you are tuning in right now, you're just tuning in. This is Sane and Saved. Together, we will all survive the coronavirus pandemic and all of the pandemics of this world that we're dealing with right now. I'm your host, Dr. Shana. My co-host is Randall F. Tucker Sr. And tonight we're dealing with the topic shelter in a time of storm. And we're talking about the different facets of shelter and how we can understand these so that we may continue to find ourselves in a place sane and safe at the same time. Let me look. We got some folks in the comments making some statements. There is, Ruby Cole says, there is value and hope in a storm. Let's see, there is value and hope in a storm. We just have to keep going. And you know, and it's so true because sometimes people get so overwhelmed that they just stop. Some folks will literally just give up. They may give up because they don't see the shelter. They don't know that there is that the shelter. Perhaps they're not connected to God. They don't know that He exists, and their emotional self is so overwhelmed that they can't even get there. Right? But there's work to do, and you can definitely get there. But you must be in a space that you are clear that you cannot do this by yourself. I think I lost my co-host. I'll wait for him to come back. So in the meantime, y'all will just get me. But I think so many times we get so weighted down. I talk to people often, and there are some who are really struggling, not just with the stress, but also, here he comes back, with the anxiety of it all. And that's what creates, in some cases, the disconnect, because all they can do is hope to get up in the morning because they're so weighted down emotionally. So it is definitely important that we don't give up, that we don't stop in the midst of it, because there is, and here's the thing, and what you're describing right now with God's presence is shelter is always available to us.
Absolutely.
Always, even when, you know, anybody been in a rainstorm where you can't see, you can't see anything because of the rain, but whether you can see it or not, the shelter absolutely continues to exist.
And Dr. Turner, let me just say this. I'm getting messages that our feed is there's a high pitched sound in our feed and echo. So I don't know if we need to
Reset. Oh,
yeah, we may need to reset.
okay. Well, we can. Do y'all hear it from? They still hear it right now?
Yeah, that's what I'm told. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I just heard it now. I'm just starting to hear that actually.
Mhm.
Okay. So I'll tell you what we'll do. We will stop and reconnect, because what we don't want is a high pitched sound. This is technology for you at your best. So y'all just hang tight. Stay on the page. We'll be right back.